Welcome back to my Devlog series for a mysterious new genre I'm working on. And if you're wondering what the heck this is supposed to be, feel free to check out my introductory video in the description, since I don't want to spend too much time rehashing stuff here. The short story is, I want to make games that take the time to fully integrate subsystems into the whole experience. And I've decided that the first step towards this is a squad-based FPS where you design your own weapons. Alright, let's start getting into the gritty details. I'm still experimenting with a full interactivity feature, or maybe I should say VR-style controls, or 2D VR, since this isn't a VR game. I would really appreciate any feedback on what you think about the control scheme, since controls are extremely important to any game, but especially because I want the controls to be more immersive than your average shooter. You can see what buttons I'm pressing in the bottom left to get a sense of what the controls are like. And you should notice that I've decided to put the left and right hands on the mouse buttons. This way you can use your hands for two different things, but obviously there's not really a way to actively reach out with both hands and do separate things. Maybe if you plugged in two mice, but then how would you use the keyboard? Anyway, the hands always start out targeting the center of the screen, and then you can move them around in the world to interact with things. I also added edge scrolling, but I'm not so sure about it. Though I do like being able to touch and centrally pet things. Yeah, nice. I do think this adds extra immersion without having to go all the way to VR. Of course, we aren't limited to just hands, so let's pick up one of these babies. Now, normally your hands are down by your side, but holding a mouse button allows you to ready what's in your hand. You can still do all your typical movement while in ready mode, walk, jump, whatever. Holding control while ready lets you go to aim mode, and you can still move around, of course. But if you hold X instead when in ready mode, it changes to manipulation mode. Here you can't move around freely, but you can manipulate whatever you have equipped. I tried to make it somewhat representative of the motions that your actual wrist would be limited to. Also, holding shift in this mode changes the axis of rotation. This way you can do all three axes with just a 2D mouse. It might be hard to tell, but you should be able to see how moving the mouse up and down is the pitch, and moving the mouse left and right is the yaw. But if you look closely, the rotations change relative to the orientation, so that when you're looking at it from the side, up and down becomes the roll instead, which I think makes more sense for your brain. Of course, holding shift will unswap this so that up and down is the pitch again. Now let's give this thing a shot. We can let go of the mouse button while holding caps lock and stay in aim mode, then tap once to pull the hammer back and rotate the cylinder, then once more to pull the trigger. Okay, let's jump back to manipulation mode. Using the other mouse button, you select whatever component or piece you want and move your mouse in the right direction. For example, to reload this revolver, first pull out the ejector, then rotate the ejector holder, and eject the first round, then rotate the cylinder, eject each round, and repeat. I think this is a good example of a default design, meaning one that would automatically be available in the game, since there are a lot of ways to improve it. So even though it may be functional, it's suboptimal for most purposes and should drive the player to want to improve it. Oh, and by the way, all of this stuff works the same with the opposite hands, which was just a lot of figuring out exactly what to duplicate and mirror all over the place. Alright, maybe that was kind of a big info dump. Let's take a break and do a little daydreaming. So I've got these giant static Mickey Mouse hands as placeholders, and they just snap into different positions, right? What I'd really like someday is to have fully animated first-person arms and the hands would actually follow and point to things. Specifically when you're trying to select smaller components, it would be cool if it changed to a finger pointing to keep things more visible. I'll probably need canned animations for each type of component anyway, so swapping the hover animation based on the nearest component is probably not a big deal. Speaking of animations, it would be awesome for NPCs to have decent animations for player designs. One way might be to record the player's reload sequence, and then play those back for NPCs. Maybe even give the player a reload shortcut option which applies the best achieved time. That could add another bit of depth for the player to experiment with. I wonder if it would be easier if the player just provided an action sequence rather than recording their input though. Maybe the player can go into the designer and select pre-made actions needed for a reload. Then the game can just do some IK solving mixed with canned animations to get something decently convincing for the whole reload process. Okay, now let's get back down to earth with some problems and some solutions. Manual component collisions. I thought this would be some sort of option in the engine, but I ended up doing collisions between components manually, which is kind of a nightmare. The way I did it was to add a new object collision channel just for interactable components, then whenever a component is being moved, check for overlaps, and then undo the movement if there were any overlaps. This worked pretty well for a while, but then I wanted to link components together so that cocking the hammer will also rotate the cylinder. To do this, I just went with the most naive approach for easy debugging. Unfortunately, this ends up lagging the game if you're constantly forcing some components to collide, because I just slowly reduced the amount of movement until there is no more overlap. To fix this, I'm thinking it might be enough to sort of binary search my way out of the overlap. Another improvement might be to remember if the object was already colliding and just skip trying to move. If anybody has a better solution, let me know. Mouse relative component movement. Orientation and vectors are the bane of my existence. I've gone back and forth fixing one thing and breaking the other, or everything, so many times. What I want is for the way components move to be relative to the mouse movement, but also intuitive in relation to the orientation of the component on the screen. This is driving me crazy because sometimes the movement makes perfect sense, sometimes it's completely inverted, and other times the movement is extremely stiff, meaning I have to move my mouse across my entire desk just to get it to move at all. Please, somebody help me end this nightmare. Hand orientation. Speaking of orientation problems, this one is just visual, so not really that important right now, but why can I never get the right orientation when my hands collide with objects? It seems like both hands are always wrong, but in different ways. I want the hands to always be oriented up or away from the player. For example, I've got the normal from the hit result, but I have no idea how to decide that the hand should be pointing up when touching the front of this wall, and also have it pointing away from the player on the sides and top of this wall. If you know what I'm missing, please help save my sanity. And that's enough complaining. Let's get back on track with the priority to-do list. I still want to keep exploring this pseudo VR control scheme, and get more sophisticated with the code behind weapon operation. My current goals are to properly implement the behavior of single action and double action revolvers, figure out an intuitive control scheme for them, and start working on customizable ammo. For single action revolvers, the hammer will have to be manually cocked or you can't pull the trigger, but if you hold the trigger back and quickly cock and release the hammer, you should be able to fire very quickly. For a double action, pulling the trigger will cock the hammer, then pulling it back all the way will fire, but also cocking the hammer all the way back will pull the trigger into firing position. As far as controls go, I want to be able to fan the hammer for fast single action fire, hold the trigger down for double action fire, and tap the trigger in double action to cock the hammer only, then tap again to fire. Now, if all that goes well and there's nothing else to fix, then I'd also like to start working on customizable ammo. I'm currently using the free Easy Ballistics plugin from the UE Marketplace, but it isn't really built to be able to handle runtime customizable ammo. It expects you to pass the class of the bullet type you'd like to instantiate, which probably works for 99% of the projects out there, and while it does let you put different classes in the same magazine, that still doesn't allow the player to create different ammo types at runtime. So I'll need to start reworking how projectiles are spawned to get access to various things. First, the plugin uses an internal random stream for things like spread. I'd rather have this be external, so the weapon itself has more control over these things. Next, and more importantly, I need to be able to provide all the parameters that the player chose for their custom projectile to each instance spawned when firing. Usually there's only one, but things like shotguns make this more complicated. Some of these parameters might be things the plugin doesn't care about, like the 3D model or materials on the projectile. The main issue is that the plugin calculates a lot of parameters before spawning the bullets by assuming that the default version of the bullet class will have the right data. In my case, this isn't true, but I'm not going to throw out the whole plugin. I'm going to modify it to suit my project's needs. Finally, I do want to keep this interesting for people out there. One of the things I've been avoiding is animating anything, but I can see how that might be annoying for the video with things just teleporting everywhere. So if that's something that would make things easier to understand or even just more interesting to watch, then I can bump up the priority on that as well. If there are some things that you specifically want to see or want me to explain how I did or whatever, then just let me know, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.